We're just entering into the third thematic, and this is about organisational forms. So this one is really future orientated. It's about considering strategies for moving forward, and we're asking you to explore and critically analyse key ideas around self-organisation. And I suppose the backdrop we think opened up today in relation to the question of organisational forms was making the point that we're not trying to define a territory, we're really trying to establish a commons. And that said, we have to acknowledge, of course, I think it's come up in some of the feedback already, that artist-led initiatives and organisations have different genealogies. The history, if you like, of your formation has a lot to do with your identity and your organisational structure. And I suppose that led us to think about and to consider Michael's presentation.
Michael had one of the slides mentioned as sort of an ecosystem of the idea of a biological model for organisational form. And of course you always see, whenever we come to talk about organisational form, biological metaphors persist. So it is, to continue that tradition, there's that idea of a cell. Like a cell is essentially a boundary that closes in certain elements as a form of constituting a space. Like somebody on one table would say, should it be just artist-led organizations, or should it be bigger than that? So that's a sort of a boundary issue, and it relates to the porousness of an organizational form, who can play, who can't play, an inside and an outside. Obviously, then, in terms of organizational forms, the whole kind of idea of horizontal authoritarian structures, non-hierarchical structures versus authoritarian structures. There's a certain co-opting of the sort of non-hierarchical, and certainly, within the corporate sphere, that you have a plant, you have, sort of informal coffee areas and informal dress codes, and it's a construction of informality presented within the most ruthless form of production control. So it's a sort of again, it's a co-opting of that language. The other co-opting that takes place is always Deleuze and Guattari are endlessly introduced with their rhizomal organization. And of course, they never intended an ethical split between what they called arboresque thinking or arboresque thinking, as in the structure of a tree, root, system, and branches. They were just observing that the structure of most of our knowledge systems within Western traditions are structured around the image of the tree, and that a rhizomal form of organization functions differently and has different points of connectivity, but not necessarily superior or better than. It was never presented in that sort of ethical formation. So I suppose, to end with Marx, as in Groucho, if it's a club, it's not I heard that famous joke about I wouldn't want to join a club that would have me as a member. So it's a bit like what is the self-constitution possibilities here in terms of the sort of forms of organization we're talking about, and that problematic of how can you constitute an ongoing solidarity or an ongoing sense of collectivity without self-specifying in some way, to some degree, so you can say, well, this is the kind of thing we are. So.
Okay, well, I think that's a point at which we'll hand back to the moderator.
So the first question about possible organisational forms. There was a suggestion that maybe this is something that happens slowly over time, and we start by building a network that eventually becomes something more established in relation to our own demands. There's a point made that the diversity between arts-led institutions is a good thing and perhaps shouldn't be made into a separate structure, and that there's a real freedom in picking and choosing from models from other institutions and some kind of collective knowledge. The need for, though, overall a strong representation of arts-led institutions, and we were comparing it to the National Campaign for the Arts, and we kind of agreed that before we pick our organisational form, we need to know what we're trying to accomplish, because different forms might suit different purposes, such as a federation for lobbying or a co-op for resources. So first that we need to find what it is that we want to achieve, and then we can choose the appropriate structure. Other forms mentioned were teams and clubs, or something a bit less formal than the ones listed on the question. And then the second question, we talked about the possibility of self-identification as being the criteria to get into this hypothetical club or network, and recognise that sometimes people self-identify as things that other people necessarily don't see them as, but agreed that it's probably the best category of naming what an arts-led institution is people who call themselves arts-led institutions, and the possibility of using humour or self-awareness in this criteria. Jason was talking about a club where you had to self-identify as an eccentric in order to get in, and this kind of like alternative ways of joining clubs. The problem of defining what is normative within artist-led institutions, considering their diversity, the setup of the question to automatically assume that this network would be a club rather than, for example, an open forum. And there's also then a thing about exclusivity being a desirable factor in perhaps creating some kind of mythology. And then the third question, there was a suggestion to put forward some kind of collective constitution based on the ambitions that we realised. We talked about the model of cluster, which spans different kind of institutional forms, and therefore can't really have collective constitutions in the same way that might be possible here. Again, that we need to find our cause before we can take this action, and again the need for a self-definition, control over our own way of describing ourselves, and then presenting that for public awareness.
In terms of what organisational forms could be adopted, the coalition, the union, the networking foundations, we thought that perhaps we didn't know enough about these structures, but in terms of the whole... Okay. But just in terms of the horizontal versus the hierarchical structures, we thought that the preferred artist-led model would be a horizontal structure, collective identity, and run on the, I guess when I say meritocracy. The second question, as a club, how hard should it be to get into? We didn't really answer this, did we? We didn't really understand what was meant by the club, whether it was the board that runs an organisation or the organisation itself. So we kind of passed on to the last question: what are the steps needed to move towards self-constitution and to be financially independent was the first point that comes up with you. Then that it would be generated by the needs of like-minded people, just then to think about the point of contact and the definition of the audience that group would be serving, and the definition of the self and stability. So that's all we.
I think Mitch is handing over as part of a kind of gesture of recognising the simplicit. We're not. The simplicit. Can you? Okay. Sorry. It's a gesture on Mitch's part to recognise the embedded complicity within the structure of how we're even speaking at this event, in terms of representational models of discourse, and to look at that, because obviously there was a lot of complexity in what we were saying, and this sense that there would be that one person doing this, one person doing another function, that even that was making us very aware in a very self-reflexive way of the complexity of that idea of representational models. And obviously we were looking at and critiquing the kind of embeddedness and taking for grantedness of a centralised model of representational democracy, and how that reflects then on how we think of and imagine new forms of modelling in terms of power, and trying to defy the kind of embedded hierarchies and the kind of institutional hierarchies that do they are taken as givens a lot of the time, and they shouldn't be. In terms of imagining alternatives and coming up with different vocabularies and metaphors, maybe whether biological or otherwise, whether it's to do with the cell formation you were talking about, the rhizomatic one, which I do think actually was ethical. I would have to say, being a kind of diehard sales secretarian, I do think it was ethical, and I think they said that in many interviews, because it was to do with what they would have called a plane of immanence, a mode of existing, that one exists in a certain way on a daily basis in terms of how one thinks and conceptualizes, and that feeds inevitably into how you confront power on a daily basis. But so really, all of us were pretty much confounded and struggling with so many levels of presumption, I suppose, within certain terms of the question, and also with the impossibility of being represented, of us abstracting out from that. This is the thing to do again with complexity and simplification and detail and abstraction. It's always a political act. So I think that was what we were struggling with.
Thanks very much.
What organisation forms could be adopted? A coalition, a union, a network, other formations. We say there's a plurality of independent models, so many is the answer. As a club, how hard should it be to get into? No, there shouldn't be a club. What are the steps needed to move towards self-constitution? We had organic growth and not top-down.
We spoke about different terms for organisational forms or alliances. We spoke about CIP2 as a cultural representative, but that apparently it's too expensive for artists to be represented by CIP2, but if we came with an organisation, they might support that. We talked about this setting up this kind of organisation as a process instead of looking at it as something that we jump straight into, so it would be something that comes along step by step. So we talked about maybe an online form as a test. We also got into the idea of that there is competition between organisations, unfortunately. But that we need to come together because we are also in competition with other sectors. So we need to get across our cultural value. So we need to alleviate the competitiveness between the organisations. How do you remove the organisations from day-to-day thinking and into future thinking? Again, we went back to this idea of testing things out. And a step with organisations asking themselves if this is possible. We spoke about the issue with organisations in terms of them being closed spheres, that there's cronyism going on, which was mentioned in the FOOTFALL booklet that somebody brought. That if this organisation is going to be brought together, that there needs to be a clear set of objectives. We need to have deliberative discussions like this one, but that the network becomes a job in itself instead of means to achieving things. We spoke about influx in Limerick a few years ago and FOOTFALL, that these events generate meetings of ideas and information coming together, that maybe something could be organised that runs every 2 years, that responds to changes like policy changes, and that we are seen to be active as a sector.
Question one, what organisational forms could be adopted? We identified that this was quite political language, unions and coalitions. Some of us feel that unions don't exist anymore, that they have no power nowadays. I suggested a cult, which nobody went for. I then suggested a dictatorship, but no, that was vetoed. Perhaps we could try to come up with another concept for a union or a cooperative group. So the nature of artist-led groups is that they are unions that then evolve. They're different to other workspaces because they have different goals, and so there needs to be different dynamic than a business model. There are queries then about contracts and agreements, about the nature of democracy. Are things like artist-led organisations democracies, yes or no? So there's a need to identify a methodology to evolve and be successful, and how do you go beyond these obstacles? We also spoke about the differences between the gallery space and an artist-led workshop or an artist-led, my words are leaving me, that these have different functions. So something like art space or engage differs dramatically to 126, and that these are different functions. To sustain with continuation, we asked, do you need new board members forever?
that the dynamic needs to change. And the structure you want cannot operate like a business. There's an institutional element to the notion of the artist-led. We also spoke about the fact that things change if you have a group of 7 that goes to a group of 25. So you need a recognition of the different potential formats for sustainability. And when the organisation has already successfully existed, there has to be a formula for change to keep it relevant and contemporary. So we came up with all of these things. We haven't really come up with typified organisational forms, but we have theories about what they could potentially be or what they could do. Question 2, as a club, how hard should it be to get into? We also had a little bit of an issue about the notion of the club. We did come up with some criteria. So the minimum would be an art college education, that you need to have a contemporary arts organisation recognise it. But if not that, then a mode of professionalism, because you can encounter self-taught artists who are very successful. So exhibiting nationally, internationally, or perhaps have work in a collection. Marcel pointed out that 1 to 6 need to have 2 solo exhibitions or a degree, and he felt this was fair. So there have to be modes of professionalism, professional artists. If they have to identify themselves as an artist, and that artist is their main job, and this is very important. The fact that anybody can become a member of 1 to 6 is good, but there has to be different categories for exhibitions. Finally, question 3, what are the steps needed to move towards self-constitution? So people with different skill sets and capabilities, you need to have a numbers guy, you need to have a visual guy, you need to have a writer, a researcher, people that can bring these different skill sets to the community. There have to be defined roles within the organisation at the outset, and a renewal and a re-examination of these every so often to make sure that they're not becoming slack. In these roles you have certain responsibilities, you have to have integrity, there has to be a recognition of human nature as well, but an ability to realise that things don't always get done and we are human beings, and kind of a bit of empathy and compassion. You need contacts, and again this goes back to the idea of community, so you need help from other sources to build a strong community, and you need an ethos, your belief has to be strong, you need to have desire, and you need to have trust.